Croall and Sandra back. I've just sent a request to Thomas, so hopefully he is going to join us if I send that request.
There we go. I'm now unmuted.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you for joining us, Thomas. Special guest on the panel. A quick question that came in, I think it was when Sandra was talking actually, was from Terence Lee, and it was, what do you believe is the best way for resilience teams to actually demonstrate operational resilience? Well, we have seen some companies cutting their BCM teams during the pandemic due to budget, and also because they provide low value to prepare to recover from such a pandemic. And because it was said in your speech, Sandra, if you want to start the answer, that'd be brilliant, and then we can pass it around.
Okay, well, I mean, I find, and it sort of chimes in a little bit with the sort of heat map type argument as well, is that, you know, picking up on both what Michael was saying and also James was saying, is that, you know, when you're looking at a risk, they're not in isolation. You know, you never get one single risk. It's loads of different things. So what I tend to do with boards is very much bring those risks to life. So I would take an organisation's risk register, and then I'd look at, you know, I've got one here. What if that one happened? That one went positive. That one went negative. This one, and then build a scenario. And so I tend to use scenarios and executive coaching techniques to bring out the what if, to actually bring those to life. You know, I find that, you know, that provides the value. So because when you're demonstrating value to an organization, especially if you're demonstrating value to the board, it's not about, you know, how clever I am. This is what I've done, and I've put this in place, and I've bought these seats, or I've done this, and I've, you know, secured X, Y, and Z. It's actually about what have I enabled the directors to do. The directors of the organization have got to manage the overall risk. They are accountable for the overall risk and responsible for it. And so by providing and bringing it to life and allowing them to practice, if you like, or rehearse about how that would play out, but also use it as a bit of a sort of stress test to say, well, how would I change my corporate strategies? Would that then fit in the future? Then you're giving something back. So rather than, hey, I'm the board, I've done this, aren't I clever? It's actually showing them and giving them something, and then they and the value, you know, comes out that way.
Brilliant, thank you. Just because Thomas has just joined us, have you got any thoughts on that, Thomas, before opening up to the other two? And I'll get us another question after that.
I think the perception of value add is where many practitioners, for sometimes through no fault of their own, have positioned themselves in the organization, and a lot of business continuity activity focuses in on very tactical solutions to issues. Those tactical solutions are absolutely necessary, but if you're actually going to add that value and be seen as a value adder, you need to proposition the question to the board of when key decisions are going to be being made, essentially. So when investment decisions are being made, when IT strategy is being reviewed, where is both business continuity and operational resilience being considered at those points? So it's built in at inception. It's not being seen as a tactical bolt-on to an existing business model. So one of the things that stood out to me, we're talking about operational resilience, and part of the operating model of an organization is a key strategic question. So in this COVID environment, what are business continuity operational resilience professionals doing right now to challenge the fundamental operating model? Does that mean we don't need offices anymore? Possibly. It's a question organizations should explore. We've had the world's largest proven work from home test. There's many different factors, many other questions on top of that one, but that's just one example of
yeah, and I didn't give you any money for this, Thomas, but that is what episode 2 is about next week.
Oh, is it? There we go. There's your segue.
So maybe we'll open up that next week. But
and I think Lee, sort of come on that, you know, just to come quickly on that, on the BCI have just done a big survey on, you know, are they connected? And also I've just written their, the return to work recovery course, and that absolutely says that the world is going to be different over here, and you're going to have to sort of move it through a precarious exit. You can't afford to wait until you've moved to it to then put the business continuity in place. You've got to have a safety net before you start in there. Interestingly, we found a very high percentage actually tied in to those strategic chains, along with the 75% were changing. We actually found a large percentage now of business continuity people tapped in, and organizational resilience tapped into those and informing it, which was fabulous news.
Brilliant, thank you, Sandra. I'm going to just fire another question to maybe Michael and James to bring them into the panel discussion. So this was from Bob Barkley. I think he's at I know he's at ABN AMRO, although it's hard for me to say after half a pint. But he's had to drop off, unfortunately. But he was saying, do you see a challenge between the costs of managing climate change and pandemic management risks versus shareholder value? So I will go to James, if that's all right, and then to Michael.
Yeah, so a nice light question. I don't think there should be a challenge, because the cost of not addressing climate change is going to far outstrip the cost of addressing climate change, is my short answer. We're seeing companies who, just at a high level, base risk assessments on 100-year floodplain, 500-year floodplains, not taking into account that the world is changing, that the climate is changing. We saw that particularly with Hurricane Harvey in the United States in 2017. The maps of Houston were based on a lot of wetlands, a lot of areas for runoff. Those had been built up. Those had been turned into suburbs, into cities, into concrete. When that storm hit, right, you immediately flooded for the first time in 150 years downtown Houston. I know several companies based there. They would have gladly paid ahead of time now, thinking about it, doing climate change assessments, doing, physical assessments. That cost would have been a lot less than we lost our headquarters or we lost a 5-story building and we have to relocate.
Great, Michael. Oh, Michael, I think you might be on mute. Oh no, you're back on.
Part of the challenge is that firms can't be short-sighted. They need to look at the long term, and that goes back to the blog I wrote in December. What's our future? Is it a Blade Runner future or a Star Trek future? The choices we as individuals as well as organizations make today, will direct us towards what our future is. Is it that, environmental disaster dystopia with lots of health and safety risks and everything combined with it of a Blade Runner? Or is it more of, that, view of, San Francisco you get in the Star Trek movies, where everything's green and collaborating? I mean, these are real choices that we make today that have long-term impacts. And so is there potential short-term costs? Definitely. But the long-term benefits are what we need to be focused on. But you also see that those that do have strong ESG commitments, environmental social governance, or formerly corporate social responsibility, that a lot of organizations that have those commitments actually have good returns and are good, solid companies. So I would go back to the Economist magazine's cartoon from a couple weeks ago. I love their little cartoons that they have in the Economist magazine. But it had a boxing ring and it had the world fighting the coronavirus. And they're pretty much like evenly, heights and things. But coming into the ring, you had the climate change, which was like significantly larger than the coronavirus. And that's what we face. And we've got to be facing these realities. I mean, just look at what had happened to Australia at the wildfires and a lot of these devastations that are happening. And so we need to be prepared if we want to sustain business for decades to come.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to, that image was brilliant. And I'm just going to say, Danny, get that on the illustration. So you might see that as part of the illustration that Danny's crafting as we speak. So that's great. Okay, I did forget to mention, I dug out of my drawer my 1980s 3D spectacles to actually make this proper virtual, but I couldn't get it to work on my laptop actually. So I'll keep them on anyway for effect. But we did have a question from Andrew McIntyre actually. So BCM has clearly not been successful as the majority of organizations have made human huge human cuts. The exec protect the business. Where is the human ethic in the boardroom? And who would like to answer that question? And I will take those off.
Well, there's clearly not ethic in the boardroom based on these cuts and these redundancies. It's always interesting to me whenever a company experiences an initial hardship, what do they cut back on first? And a lot of organizations, it's traditionally FTEs, right? But there was a study in I think from the Harvard Business Journal 10 years ago that those companies who hit their intellectual capital first to save money are the ones that take the longest to recover from events. You can't replace your intellectual capital, your experts. You had them there for a reason. And so it's astounding to me right now seeing companies really hit their risk departments to save money.
Fantastic. Anyone else on that one? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, and then I've got another couple.
I'd really argue. I don't think business continuity, departments have failed at all. They all, the plans and the capabilities are put in place based on planning assumptions. And the planning assumptions are based on the risk appetite of the board, as well as the requirements that you have to do with from a government's perspective and a regulatory legal perspective. And so the board should, as we heard before, most people's pandemic plans were based on swine flu, which actually was an outlier when you compare it to the other pandemics that we've had over the centuries. So that one was a bit of an outlier, as and so COVID is more like the other ones. Presumably the board were aware, and the business continuity people wrote down the risk assessment and the risk appetite, and so everyone would have been aware and going forward. So it's agreed. You don't write a business continuity plan without agreeing the risk appetite with the board. I mean, that's just wrong.
I'd like to just jump in here.
Yeah, go for it, Michael. Over to you.
Has BCM failed in some organizations? Definitely, but I would also argue that there's a lot of BCM professionals that are operating anti. That they're stuck in the bowels of IT with disaster recovery obligations, even though they know that BCM so much more and should be looking at these other things. They're not given the authorization and authority to build a true BCM program. I mean, there's a lot of BCM professionals out there that have a broader perspective and understand this, but where they're placed in the organization and the attention they're given from the organization, that's what's handicapped it.
I'd add on to that.
Isn't that a failure of communication?
It's ignorance is what it comes down to.
Thomas, I think you were going to say something.
Failure of communication, but it's also just we can communicate and tell people these other risks, but if people aren't listening and they have their head stuck in the sand, we're not going to get anywhere.
Thomas, did you have?
Yeah, I'd add on, and I'd also relate back to my previous comments and previous comments of the speakers. So where is the risk owned? The risk is owned by the entire board that sets the direction and strategy. Depending on the mandate and the parameters that the business continuity professionals have been allowed to operate in, they're possibly only bolstering a fair weather business strategy that's only going to work in let's just say normal conditions with certain hits that the business will take, but we're increasingly going to see shocks and stresses. And relating it back to my previous comments, I think all businesses need to challenge themselves to say, is our strategy fit for purpose in the risk environment we exist now and going forward? And if we are a fair weather business, what are the financial reserves that we need to put aside to make sure we can retain our key assets, such as our people, through that period, in the same way that many of the banks since the financial crisis have now required to have significantly higher capital adequacy requirements than previously. Maybe those types of requirements need to be thought about by companies that do choose to persist business models that can't manage the shocks and the stresses of climate change to come.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just conscious of the time, but I'm okay. We've got still quite a few attendees on, so I'm happy to keep going. And then if people want to drop off, and then we can go for another 10 minutes. You know, go to about 7:40 if that's all right, if we get that far. But please stay with us. If not, and you have to drop, we'll, like I mentioned, put together the questions and the answers. And there's also a video of this that we'll be able to make available for attendees. So a quick one, which again has come from Manoj, but it's more a comment. But I think what I can spin it into a question for, or I will spin it into a question, is do the backgrounds of the actual C-suite impact how they take on board the, you know, what you're telling them from an operational resilience perspective? I know that's an easy answer, but how do we rectify that in terms of Manoj is saying if the CRO is a champion of risk management or has been in the actual departments lower and understands it? What if they're a CFO that's fallen into a CRO? I know a couple of people that did that. How do we address that at the board? Who would like to pick that one up? No one's jumping in.
I'm happy to. Sorry, Thomas. You go ahead, Tom.
No, I was. So we've already identified in the comments earlier that risk should be a shared responsibility, and maybe the role of the business continuity operation or resilience practitioner, including their board sponsor, whether it be the COO, whether it be a CFO, or maybe it's a chief risk officer. I know one example of a company, AXA, for example, has a chief resilience officer. But the point is, anybody that's the sponsor is just the facilitator. All of the board members have a responsibility for it to be embedded within their sphere of influence. And one arena I think that's been poorly represented to date and is probably needs more prominence. So this has all been back to the word operational. We're seeing it as our employees, our IT, and our physical technology and estates. But to me, I think what we're seeing in the COVID-19 is the relationship with the customer is actually one of our assets. We can't sell our product, possibly, but how do we maintain our relationship with the customer? And that's the asset that's going to get us through on the other side. And I don't think plans have really been built about communicating and maintaining that relationship effectively.
No,
it's
more
seen as a marketing, social media thing on the side.
No, I definitely agree on that. And while if somebody else wants to come in, I'm going to fire out the poll that was Michael's, which is around, if I read it out, how is your organisation structured for operational resilience? So if somebody else wants to pick up where Thomas just left, I will send that poll.
I'd like to on the board, very much on, Thomas's point, a board is a board because actually it's greater than the sum of its parts. The whole point of a board is to take different perspectives, different viewpoints, so that you can get a knotty problem to actually understand what's best for the organisation. So having it, sort of just with one individual organisation and their background, is probably going to go towards a bit of a disaster. As Thomas says, it's a facilitation. It's about, getting all of those different viewpoints, getting the collective to work together to understand what it means for the organisation, so you can change strategy very, very quickly. And as we said before, now we have to change operations very quickly on the fly as well.
Absolutely. And I'm just conscious that not everyone's voted yet, but I'll close it. I'll give a few seconds. If anyone's listening but not actually looking at the laptop, if you can click one of those, how is your organisation structured to operational resilience, segregated, disconnected, or integrated, or not sure? I've got a few more coming through now. I'll give it a few seconds. While we're doing that, I think I've got another question here from Martin Robinson, actually. Do the panel think that until procurement and legal adopt a more agile approach, organisations will remain limited in their business resilience approach? I think maybe that's from more of from a technology perspective. But especially with the third episode being about fintech and AI, would anyone like to answer that question? Again, did the panel think until procurement and legal adopt a more agile approach, organizations will remain limited in their approach?
Sorry, Lee, can I jump in as well on this one? I think, actually, from what I've seen, procurement, accounts payable, and legal have, in some cases, be the people who have done the most agile change. We've had, accounts payable teams who were hitherto stuck in the office because, sort of the supplier master list was obviously secure, so you didn't want to have it out. So managed to work from home. Then you found them working together tightly, because if you're changing suppliers and getting information, getting stuff from where you can, actually the thing that is holding your organization together is the connection between the accounts payable and the procurement teams. And they really have, from the organizations that I've seen, they really have stepped up to the plate. Maybe quietly, but
yeah,
actually
well,
they're
from my
fantastically.
No, thank you for that. From my side of things, and I try not to give too many of my opinions on this. I'm more of the facilitator, the catalytic converter, shall we say. But I think Martin's got back saying he was thinking more contractual. But having been in my role of being more vendor side in the last 6 years, I know where he's coming from in terms of the rigmarole of getting through legal documentation and getting through procurement steps to actually address those agility if you're in the company. I've not been enrolled, but I presume that's from the side of where Martin was coming from. So James or Michael, on your side, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just go back to what Thomas said, that the entire organization owns risk. So often what we see with companies that have very laborious procurement or legal contractual requirements or processes is because something happened in the past. So let's try to mitigate that risk out of the business. And that's why a lot of people in the business or on the operations side take a dim view of risk management, because it morphs from, hey, we're here to protect you, to at its extreme, you can't do anything, here's all the things you can't do. So, I've certainly, as a practitioner, been a part of that process, trying to bring things on board, and it just becomes such a nightmare that you just give up. And to me, that's when risk management in the extreme becomes a negative to the business. It shouldn't be a hindrance to the business and how it operates.
Brilliant. And I think what Martin's just clarified his question as well, in terms of some of the headaches he's seen in the the COVID-19 situation, is obviously out of hours working for himself and his team and for his clients when they're actually doing homeschooling as well. I was chatting with somebody today actually who was trying to manage their job. He's working from 8 till 6, but he's getting interrupted by his children who are going stir crazy, like the Lord of the Flies, he was saying, and he's having to work late to actually do that. So having a board or a legal team and procurement team that are able to manage that, that kind of element is difficult, right? And again, episode 2 is about the workforce kind of changes. We can touch on those. I'm just conscious that we're at 7:35, so I reckon if we got 5 more minutes, we can close at 7:40. I know we've still got over 40 people listening in, but I reckon we'll do the last 5 minutes and we can wrap up, which would be great. So let me just find another couple of questions for you.
Lee, while you're looking for that, could I recommend a book to my fellow panelists and the audience?
You can, if it involves a big grey animal. So that's a challenge.
we said it's not a black swan, which I absolutely agree. Some of you may be aware of the grey rhino. If you're not, it's a book by Michelle Wucker, and I'm just going to read the title: The Grey Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on Obvious Dangers We Ignore. And it follows up or makes references to the black swan, but absolutely COVID-19 and climate change are both grey rhinos.
Brilliant. We certainly are adept at coming up with cool terms. Black swans,
and that book came about, for context, from the Greek debt crisis. That's where the initial thinking came from, for the grey rhino.
Yeah, and it's not something that I've come across actually. So I'll be checking that one out. And I know for, we mentioned Black Swan quite a few times. I did actually read the Nicholas Taleb book, Black Swan, and having done stats A level, I thought I'd enjoy the maths bit, but I didn't. But the rest of it was really good, and that's why we're mentioning it in terms of Black Swans, unknown unknowns, unknown knowns, all those kind of risk kind of events. So if you haven't read the Black Swan and you have plenty of time in the lockdown to do so, then it's definitely worthwhile. I'm going through the questions, so I don't know if while I'm doing that, I'll try and find one more poignant question, whether any of the panel have got something they would like to really just sum up from the session today, and really any gems you might have to leave us on, really.
I had one point I'd like to briefly make that I'm not sure was addressed, but the phenomenon that's really standing out to me right now with COVID-19 is that recovery is so important, and for so long recovery has been the poor bedfellow of response. And so all of our planning and efforts of thinking, how do we become aware of an event, and how do we initially triage it, and how do we respond to it, and the continuity phase. But essentially right now, the world as we know it is changing around us, and that recovery phase, if done right with scenario planning techniques and whatnot, that's what can really give organizations the competitive edge if they get ahead of coming out the other end before their competitors, especially with that relationship with the customer. So for me, that's one of my personal main observations and learnings.
Brilliant. Thank you.
I'd like to add.
I didn't pay him, Lee, honest.
No. Well, he's just competitive edge.
Because I've got a recovery course out.
Hey, we said no, this is not a selling situation here. So just finally, this hopefully will bring it together quite nicely, but it was from Peter again, Chelinek. Hopefully I pronounced his surname correctly, but fully agree with James. You got somebody there, James? Somebody agrees with you?
Thank you.
Is that an old fashioned you got there in the glass?
No? Just straight bourbon today, since it's only 1:30 in the afternoon. So.
Man after my own heart, that one. So yeah, fully agree with James, and it says a lot about the quality of many boards, what you were discussing. So the GCR needs to penetrate, so GRC needs to penetrate the board. How come they've been so ignorant or are so ignorant, in your opinion?
So I think a lot of that just goes back to, like we talked about earlier in the hour, that if a board only devotes half an hour or an hour to risk a year, by definition, they're going to be ignorant. They're only going to have time to discuss. Look at how long we've been on this call together discussing risk. A board devotes 15, 20 minutes to any matter, doesn't matter what it is, they're going to remain and continue to be ignorant on that subject.
Would anyone else like to just finally summarize on that one? I think Michael, go for you.
I mean, a couple things from this one, but also the previous. But good risk management is going to really require strategic alignment with the executives and the board. I really like Brad Jewett's approach. Brad Jewett was the enterprise risk director at Microsoft for several years, and he's moved on to a couple places since then. He's now the CFO to Croall Corporation. But when he was ERM director there, he had this whole approach called the rhythm of risk. And part of that was knowing that, I've got the periodic risk assessments that I've got to do every 6 months, every year, whatever it might be. And, 2/3 of my resources and people are going to be focused on the periodic and planned, but I'm going to make sure I have a good 1/3 of my resources that are focused on the strategic, and what's on the board and executive calendars. What are they talking about? What's on the agenda? And then I'm going to make sure I give them contextually relevant risk information that aligns right to what they're discussing in the agenda. Where risk isn't its own topic on the agenda, but risk is integrated to every other part of the agenda. And I really like that approach. The other thing I was going to comment on the previous question is that good risk management involves both left brain thinking and right brain thinking. Too often, I think we trap risk management in the left brain into quantitative models and that piece, but good risk management also requires good right brain thinking to be able to think outside the box and creatively about risk.
No, and that's a great way to finish, actually, because, you know, that's one of my passions, actually. The Myers-Briggs team management systems, you know, there's a plethora of those kind of models based on Carl Jung, you know, but embracing all the different personality traits as part of risk management, which they don't do. It's mainly analytical and drivers that miss the, you know, the out-of-the-box thinking that Michael was just mentioning. But I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I'd like to thank the panel for joining us and Thomas for joining us as well on the panel. And also, I just wanted to say that the next episode is 2 weeks today, and it will be on remote working. We've already mentioned like the Zoom culture and the new, is it the new normal? We obviously saw Twitter saying that their staff can stay at home. And how would that impact IT risk and wider GRC risk? Obviously, it will impact the board, as we've just been talking about. And I'm hoping all of you would love to join us then. We'd love to see you. I feel like I'm on question time. It's brilliant. But hopefully I'll see you in 2 weeks. And like I said, we've got all your questions. I'll circulate them around the speakers and Thomas and get some responses. And I will send it out with a link to the video, hopefully, and the illustration from Danny Burgess over there somewhere near London, which is great. So hopefully your microwave meals and your wine was beautiful. And I look forward to seeing you all very soon.
All right,
Cheers.
thanks,
Take
Lee.
care, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Be well. Thank you.
Cheers.